Liberia. Welcome to the show. I'm having some technical issues here. And Carl, tell a
Yes,
little background history about President's Day as I make some adjustment here.
sure. So, I mean, what I'm going to present on today is because today is President's Day in the US, and I'm just going to present on 19th century presidents, late 18th and early 19th century presidents, and their impact on Liberian history. A lot of people don't realize that the United States of America, really, Liberia was established during the time period, the tenure of its fifth president. And people, think that America is much older than it is, and as a country, as a republic. So we're going to start with some of the early presidents and what their actions or inactions did to make Liberia necessary. Starting with, of course, the first president, George Washington. Yes, so basically, I'm doing this because people don't realize, many people, even in America, but mostly in Liberia, don't really have a really good grasp of American history and how it relates to U.S. foreign policy and therefore U.S.-Liberia relationships. The very first president of the United States, of course, everyone knows, was George Washington. And although the United States declared itself independent in the year 1776, Washington, the United States, having a federal government and having a single president over multiple colonies that had declared themselves independent, did not occur until 1789. So George Washington, America's first president, did not become president at independence, but not until 1789. So he was president from 1789 to 1797. Prior to that, in between, there were always colonies that were associated but not united under one umbrella and under one flag. So 1789 is when Washington becomes the first president of 13 united colonies, which become states, and the rest is history. So that's a little known, detail that people sometimes overlook, especially people who did not go to school in the United States, elementary school, and do their early education here. So I wanted to point that out. Now, Washington was a major slaveholder before, during, and after his presidency. His wife ended up freeing his slaves or liberating his enslaved people, basically 1 year before he died, and he was ill, and she didn't see the need to keep human beings in bondage, so they were supposed to have been emancipated upon his death, but she emancipated them before he died. During his presidency, you can go ahead and look. These are three things that happened during his tenure that I think are relevant to Liberia. You can go forward, starting with 1789. Dennis? We're still on George Washington, starting with 1789.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm having some technical issues, still fixing
Okay.
them. But I think we're good now.
Awesome.
1789, the Maryland Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery and the Relief of Freed Negroes and Others Unlawfully Held in Bondage is founded.
Yes.
1792, Congress excludes blacks from military service. 1792, Freetown, Sierra Leone in West Africa is founded by 1,100 slaves who were freed by the British during the Revolutionary War.
Yes, that's correct. So the reason this is important and relevant to Liberia, these are some of the conditions that are starting to create a need for separation. In 1792, the exclusion of Black people, of African people in America from military service is basically a way to make sure that they are unarmed and not able to also defend their country and not able to defend themselves as a result. So the right to bear arms is essential to freedom in the American concept. So removing that ability and the training that they would need to defend themselves by excluding them from the military was also another way of dehumanizing them and reminding them that they were not citizens and for the most part not welcome though Black people fought for the colonies in the Revolutionary War against the British, fought on both sides, and helped to liberate the United States from British tyranny, also in the War of 1812, which comes later. But at this point, even after they died for freedom of the United States, they were now excluded from military service because for reasons I just stated. So we're going to just breeze through these slides pretty much as quickly as we can. Next slide, please.
And call the 1789, the Maryland Society for the it is founded, right? Can you someone say what that got to do with Liberia?
Well, Liberia is established because of America's tyranny and hatred for African people. So Liberia was established as an asylum for freed African people. And that's what it has to do with Liberia. If not, if this had nothing to do with Liberia, we would be Sierra Leone and maybe Guinea and Ivory Coast, if not for Liberia.
Thank you. Let's go to the next president. And we're dealing with 19th century presidents, you know. And,
late 18th, early 19th century, correct.
Yeah, late 18th and early 19th century presidents of the United States. And we say their rule, or during the time they were presidents, their connection to Liberia. That's what we're talking about.
Their decisions that led up to the establishment and creation of Liberia. Their actions made Liberia necessary. Liberia was necessary, and the idea of a country for African people to be a modern country for African people to exist in and be free of tyranny is born of tyranny. And so we're going to go through each president and discuss what actions or inactions they took to make Liberia not only necessary, but a requirement.
So John Adams.
So John Adams, yeah, he was president from 1797 to 1801. On slavery, Adams wrote, "My opinion against it has always been," now he didn't own human beings like George Washington did. John Adams did not own human beings like George Washington did. And he said, "My opinion against it has always been known." And he goes on to say nothing that has, he goes on to say basically that he's always employed freedom both as for domestic laborers, and it has never in my life did I own a slave. Why is it saying like that? Basically, he's saying never in my life did I own a slave. I think I messed up this slide. I'm sorry, guys. Basically, what he was saying is that he believed that freedom for both domestic laborers and others was required. And then he's also saying that he's never owned a slave in his life. So he's declaring to the world that he's never owned a slave. In 1795 to 1820, during a period of religious revivalism known as the Second Great Awakening, slaves convert to Christianity. From 1795 to 1820 is when many slaves converted to Christianity. This is also very important because many of the people that were behind the repatriation movement were also under the auspice of being missionaries and going and Christianizing Africa. So this period of African people converting in the United States who are enslaved, their property, but somehow there's a recognition that they're human enough to have souls and believe in God and be saved. But in this life, they don't have a right to self-determination. I mean, I don't know how people reconcile that, but that's what it was. Yeah. In the year 1800, a slave named Gabriel Prosser, believing himself called by God, organized a great plot to kill all whites in Virginia, sparing only Quakers, Methodists, and French. The conspirators met under the pretense of holding a religious meeting. So this goes back to this whole concept of liberation theology. So first they baptize these slaves, they Christianize them, thinking that that's going to erase the remnants of their traditional religions that they brought from Africa, which they felt was an affront to their being in their midst. People were still practicing their traditional spiritual beliefs. Yet and still, when they did convert, their first awakening really was to use Christianity as a tool for liberation and a tool to evoke their rebellion against their captivity.
Now, John Prosser is organizing His group.
Yes, and we're going to kill these people or we're going to get free. Next slide, please. We have a lot of slides, so I don't want to spend too much time on each one. You can go ahead, Dennis.
Thomas Jefferson is 1801 to 1809. Jefferson was a lifelong slave owner who fathered multiple enslaved children with the enslaved woman Sally Hemings, the likely half-sister of his late wife, Martha Skelton. 1804, the U.S. prohibits the importation of slaves from foreign territories into Louisiana. 1807, U.S. Congress passes an act to prohibit the importation of slaves into any port or place within the jurisdiction of the United States from any foreign kingdom, place, or country.
Yes. So this is going to be really heavily slavery themed. We had a previous episode where we talked about slavery on the Grain Coast, which is specifically ports of enslaved factories that were in modern day Liberia. Slavery affects us because many hundreds of thousands of our people were taken from the Grain Coast. I'm talking about all of West Africa, just from the region which is now Liberia, was severely affected by the transatlantic slave trade. So some of these people who are being owned and abused come from the ethnic groups that we believe to be indigenous to Liberia. How are they being treated? How is their humanness, their humanity being discounted and ignored in the New World? And why do they find a need on their own and also through the provocation of those who are holding them in captivity? Why do they find this need to return to the land of their ancestors? Next slide, please.
1809 to 1817, James Madison. Madison did not free his slaves during his lifetime or in his will. Paul Jennings, one of Madison's slaves, served him during his presidency and later published the first memoir of life in the White House. 1804, the American Colonization Society, ACS, is founded to remove free blacks from the United States and settle them in Africa. 1817 to 1819, fugitive slaves in Florida and Native Americans fight together against the forces of Andrew Jackson in the First Seminole War.
Yes. So this is really important because you have slave rebellions going on where fugitive slaves, the idea that they don't want to be in bondage, they break away, they're now fugitives or free. They're now gathering with indigenous people who are being abused and depopulated to rebel. So this idea that they need to get these free Black people off the North American continent and far away from the rest of the slaves so that they don't evoke or provoke them to rebel and also, cause bigger problems. So this is a continuing theme throughout the 18th century, which leads to the reason Liberia becomes necessary. Next slide, please.
James Monroe.
So now we're at James Monroe. And I want to point out before you read the slide, Mr. Monroe is the 5th president of the United States. So by the time they send the first 2 ships from New York to Sherbro Island in West Africa, the first time the ship Elizabeth and the brig Nautilus, the 2 first ships carrying immigrants to Liberia, this was only during the 5th presidency of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
The United States is not yet a world power. It is very weak, comparatively speaking, compared to France and England. Spain is extremely powerful. Germany does not yet exist as a country. Go ahead, please.
Right. So, yeah, talking about the 5th president, anyway, America was pretty young at that time, but let's go on. So Monroe was a lifelong slave owner who advocated for the gradual end of slavery. Monroe owned many slaves throughout his life, freeing only one of them in his final days. A protege of Thomas Jefferson, he participated in establishing and operating the American Colonization Society to remove, recapture Africans and free blacks to Africa. Ducor, was renamed Monrovia in his honor.
Yes. Now, one of the things I didn't point out, so George Washington had no political party, the first president. The second president, John Adams, was what was called a Federalist. Remember, we talked about America having these colonies. Federalism was bringing all the colonies together under one umbrella. The Federalists believed in less state rights, more centralized authority. That centralized authority is what made America powerful eventually. Consolidating power in Washington is what made America powerful eventually. The third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, was what was called a Democratic Republican. And then you had the fourth president, who was also a Democratic Republican, and James Monroe was also a Democratic Republican. Again, Duca is now called Monrovia in his honor. Except when you're speaking dialect, it's still Duca.
And when you get on my side there, we say Trubo.
Next, please.
So we got three here: John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and Martin Van Buren.
Yes.
John Quincy Adams, National Republican, did not own slaves and was against the removal of free blacks to Africa. He felt Africa was no longer their home. Though he was not an abolitionist, he's famously quoted as describing slavery as a sin before men and God.
Yes.
Andrew Jackson, a Democratic, owned slaves and was a former slave trader. During his campaign for the presidency, he faced criticism for being a slave trader. He did not free his slaves in his will, significantly reduced U.S. support to Liberia. 1834 to 1835, New York City and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania experienced riots against blacks and anti-slavery advocates. Anti-abolition riots subsequently break out in major cities across the Northeast. Martin Van Buren is a Democrat, also owned one domestic slave. 1839, Africans commit mutiny on the Amistad. 1841, the U.S. Supreme Court declares that the mutinous Africans from the slave ship Amistad are removed to Freetown in West Africa.
Yes. So this is really important. Ethnically speaking, the majority of people, they like to say they were Mende on the Amistad. I don't think they were. They were Mende-related ethnic groups. So you had people with names like Nyakwe on the Amistad, and other names that could also be considered like Singbe, the leader of the mutiny. What they were all members of the same alliance, which Mende people are members of that alliance, which is, as we all know, Poro. And so these Poro warriors on the Amistad rebelled and overthrew, murdered everyone except the captain who they needed to navigate them back to West Africa. They were not from Sierra Leone. They were from the Gola Forest region, really, which is, at that time, there was no country called Sierra Leone. So that was all actually Liberian territory at this time. And they were returned to Sierra Leone because ACS didn't want a bunch of revolutionary Black people in the colony, further inciting people like Elijah Johnson. So they were sent to Sierra Leone, which is very strange because they should have been sent to Liberia. Anyway, they were settled in Sierra Leone, and this was a landmark case because they're basically saying that, you know, these people have a right to not be kidnapped and dragged into slavery. And if that happens, you have a right to defend yourself with violence. This sends a terrible message to slaveholders, because if you're saying that someone is in captivity and they can kill for their freedom, and the U.S. Supreme Court can release these people, then this is a problem for those of us who have slaves. And so Martin Van Buren is really against this because his constituents are against it. John Quincy Adams actually serves as an advocate for these Africans and helps them to carry their case to the Supreme Court. And at that time, he was a former president, of course. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. 1841, William Henry Harrison, a Whig. Harrison owned several slaves. As the first governor of the Indiana Territory, he unsuccessfully lobbied Congress to legalize slavery in Indiana. John
Yes.
Tyler, also a Whig, never freed any of his slaves and consistently supported the slaveholders' rights and the expansion of slavery during his time in political office. James K. Polk, 1845 to 1849, a Democrat, owned slaves, and as president, he strongly supported the rights of slaves owners. 1847, yes. Refused to recognize the establishment of the Republic of Liberia.
And that's very important. So people like to say that America created Liberia. We've heard our politicians thank America on our founding day or Independence Day, whatever you want to call 1847. They thank America for creating and establishing the country. The United States was violently and adamantly against an independent Black country of people who descended from their former slaves.
Has a government policy.
As a government policy, as a philosophy, as an understanding in their minds of what Africans should and should not do. Removing Africans and putting them on a sort of reservation far away from where they can cause trouble as freemen is quite different from those freemen now getting up and governing themselves. It sends a signal to the world that sovereignty is the property of all human beings, not just white men. So this is a very powerful move in 1847. Did not occur in Sierra Leone or anywhere else. Haiti had a revolution, a very bloody revolution, and Haiti was stigmatized, ostracized, and there was the first economic embargo in world history was against Haiti. The same thing is about to happen to Liberia. All kinds of efforts to sabotage this liberty that is attained. And all they were trying to do was what all men in the world and all women in the world strive to do, which is assert the God-given right to self-determination. That was their crime. So they were not recognized, because how can you recognize African sovereignty and still hold African people in captivity as property even? Not just in captivity. They're not just in captivity. They're actually property, deeded property.
And how can you recognize these people as a country, meaning that they are equal to you two as a country? You don't want to see it.
So I don't think, even today that it's recognized that African countries are equal. I don't think it was a matter of equality. I think it was a matter of recognizing their human right to self-governance. That was what they weren't recognizing. There's never been a point in time in the entire history of Liberia or any African country that any European state recognizes the right of African people as equal to their own in their policy, in their conduct, in their trade, everything that they do. So the equality question is not even a question. It has not even been attained in their minds. This is why economic exploitation and everything else that occurs without any remorse, because it is not a question of equality. It is a question of just your basic human right to self-determination.
You are not human being enough. And
Yeah.
African countries, we are not helping ourselves by the actions we take.
Yeah, and we need to understand that we are human beings. You have to believe in your own right to self-determination to conduct yourself as such. When you do not have the self-esteem to conduct yourself with respect, that's what happens. So that is definitely on us to do.
And it's true. And Carl, I was telling you about a show yesterday where someone trying to demean in their mind, one of us has said, "Oh, the person is he speaks and that's Gribble," because that's the kind of self-hate, or you don't think you are a human being enough. But we praise people who have American accent, but you demean others who you think have Gribble accent or Loma accent or Gio accent, and that's supposed to be a shame. So here, a group of people who refuse to recognize the establishment of Liberia as a republic because they don't feel we are human beings enough for self-governance.
Yeah. Which is
And
just, or just, or just having swallowed, it's internalized oppression. You swallow the oppression and you start to see yourself through the eyes of the people who oppress you instead of seeing yourself through your own eyes. And this is what we do with history. We see history, we see ourselves and our ancestors through the eyes of people who have demeaned us, who hate us, and don't recognize our humanity. So we oversimplify things. We actually believe our ancestors were just running around in the bush waiting for somebody to come give them a country. We actually believe our ancestors were sitting around and a little ship of people came and beat them up and took their land. You wouldn't believe that if you really understood who you were and if you understood the context of world history. But we think that victimization and internalized, diminishing yourself and making yourself pitiful is not liberating. It isn't, and it isn't even the truth. But we'll get to that. I mean, this is what the History Channel's for.
Right. And once more, to continue to look up to country as your savior or as your father, okay, and we boast of the connection as that or child figure for this almighty father who is supposed to look out for you, watch your back, and put in place policies that will benefit you, even if your own people are not doing the same thing to benefit yourself.
Right. Sad. Very sad.
Zachary Taylor, awake, owned and enslaved human beings until his death. 1849, Liberia is recognized as a sovereign state by Britain. Joseph Jenkins Robert, the son of free Virginian blacks, becomes the first president. The United States refused to recognize Liberia.
For the same reason.
And my friend, anyway, there are people in Liberia named Zachary Taylor. We love this so much. 1850 to 1853, Miller Fillmore did not own human beings. 1850 refused to recognize Liberia, stating this was no time to agitate the situation on the slavery issue. However, his quoted as saying, I know of no more useful purpose to which a portion of the public revenues could be devoted than this, the removal of free blacks. Franklin Pierce did not own human beings, supported the removal of free blacks, and refused to recognize Liberia as a sovereign state.
So you see a theme there? You're not going to be running around talking about your presidents and trying to trade with us on an equal footing and trying to conduct business. We're going to have our philanthropists / business people there, not only to make sure you people stay in line, but also to conduct commerce and build revenue for the United States through trade with the indigenous people. So all this time, now Liberia is independent. This is not a good thing for America because they didn't want a colony there, but they certainly didn't want these people to be self-determinant. So if you notice, even they don't own slaves, they still support the removal of free black people. Mm-hmm. They still support mass deportation of the people who built the country, no less.
Yeah. So James Buchanan did not own slaves. His cousin served as
did not own human beings. I changed the language to human beings because it's important. He didn't own human beings.
Right. Did not own human beings. His cousin served as the first official governor of the ACS, controlled the colony of Liberia.
Yes.
Abraham Lincoln, 1861 to 1865, did not own human beings, but was a staunch advocate for the removal of free blacks from the United States. On the night of December 31st, 1862, a day before he issued the final Emancipation Proclamation to effectively end slavery in America, President Abraham Lincoln signed a contract with Bernard Koch, an entrepreneur and Florida cotton planter. Their agreement to use federal funds to relocate 5,000 formerly enslaved people from the United States to El Vashi, Cow Island, a small 20 square mile island off the southwestern coast of Haiti, first to
Yes.
recognize Liberia on September 25, 1862.
Yeah. So they wanted to remove them to Cow Island. The reason that didn't really resonate much is because you had Paul Coffey and other African Americans who were on their own without assistance from the government, transporting free people to the west coast of Africa in the vicinity of Sierra Leone. And this is why ACS ends up going to that area as well. So Liberia ends up being where it is, mostly because of Black people on their own accord, relocating, signing their own treaties with indigenous people for land before 1822, before 1820, because it was in the vicinity of Sierra Leone, and that coastal area had abolished the slave trade, that very slither near Sierra Leone. And as Liberia comes in, Liberia to Sherbro, slavery, the slave factory at Sherbro Island had just been shut down, so they were there. Same thing when they got to Cape Mesurado. Though most of the Cape was still selling slaves, Providence Island had shut it down. So these are some of the things that we need to understand that were going on. We would have probably had African Americans sent to South America and the Caribbean instead of Africa, if not for their own determination to go to Africa itself. It was African Americans saying, no, you didn't take us from Haiti, you didn't take us from Costa Rica, all these other places you're trying to send us to. You took us from West Africa, and there is where we're going, from whence we came.
1865 to 1869, Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's former vice president. Johnson owned enslaved human beings and was supporter of James Polk's slavery policy.
Yes. So Ulysses Grant.
1869 to 1877, Ulysses S. Grant, a Republican, owned enslaved human beings and enlisted 179,000 Black men, 10% of the Union Army, who served as soldiers in U.S. Army, and another 19,000 who served in the Navy.
Exactly.
18. So at some point.
So Ulysses Grant. So War of 1812.
Right.
The British are basically whipping Americans. They then allow, in 1812, I skipped over that part, they allow some free Blacks to fight in the War of 1812.
Right, because before that was outlaw, right?
Yeah, it was outlawed, but because they were losing, they now employ people like the founder of our sovereignty, Elijah Johnson, of our modern sovereignty, I'll say, because we were sovereign Africans, but we would have been colonized like everyone else in Africa if it were not for Elijah Johnson. The founder of our modern sovereignty, Elijah Johnson, fought in the War of 1812. Those kind of Black people had to go. So Elijah Johnson goes to Liberia, and because of his training in war, and his understanding of the world, he's able to thwart British conquest of Liberian territory early on. And that was very powerful. So now it is not until 1869 that Ulysses Grant made a decision which allowed the Union forces, which is the northern states, to actually win the Civil War, because they allowed all of these thousands of African people to fight on behalf of the Union Army. And we've talked about that in previous episodes in really great detail. With the Juneteenth episode, if you're curious to know more about it, you can go and watch the Juneteenth episode, which was on, when did we do it? June 18th of 2022. So it's very detailed about this.
1877 to 1881, Rutherford B. Hayes appointed John S. Smythe as minister to Liberia. Smythe Row is named after this person, I guess.
I don't know. There were a lot of people who emigrated that also, especially recaptured Africans, had a tendency to adopt the names of American presidents.
Yeah, I'm talking Smythe. So 1881, James.
Oh, you're talking about John Smythe?
Yeah.
Yeah, John Smythe. I don't know. I think it's possible because he was the first. I'm sorry, I thought you were talking about Hayes.
No,
Smythe was the first. He was the first minister basically to Liberia.
Was minister? Oh, minister in the minister.
Basically, ambassador is the best way to put it. So, but at that time they were called ministers.
Oh, okay. 1881, James Garfield, prominent members of the African American community petitioned President James A. Garfield to appoint Garnett U.S. Minister to Liberia. Garnett's presence in Liberia was extremely helpful in maintaining Liberian sovereignty. What did he do?
So basically, Garnett was the one who was asking for assistance from the U.S. government, intervention. There was, at this point in time, from James Garfield died in office. That's why he only served for a few months. But this appointment that he made was important because this was a minister, an ambassador, a U.S. representative in Liberia who was making every effort to communicate how the British government, which was attempting to sabotage Liberia. In his memoirs, he documents how, in letters to the state, back to the United States, he's documenting how the British were arming and inciting indigenous people against the state, and even going as far as to give them the British flag to replace, to remove the Liberian flag and replace it with the British flag in the Liberian territory. So the only reason, Garfield is important to Liberia is because he was able to appoint this ambassador that was very active and very vocal about the sabotage of the British against the Black Republic, against Black sovereignty, really. Because what I want to remind everyone is, at this point in history, sovereignty, the only option for Black sovereignty was Liberia. The traditional African sovereignty was no longer an option for us, except those who existed within the Liberian territory. So if you're not Liberian, you are going to be a subject of France. If you're not Liberian, you're going to be a subject of England. Those were the options. The world had changed. And that was the fate of everyone else on the continent, with the exception of Ethiopia. That was the fate of everyone else on the continent. So many indigenous people recognize this and work to maintain their land ownership and their sovereignty instead of being displaced and all the things that happen to our neighbors.
1881 to 1885, Chester A. Arthur, Republican, he attempted to aid Liberia through his appointed ambassadors or ministers at London and at Monrovia. His government endeavored to assist Liberia in its, with Great Britain boundary encroachment, strong advocate of repatriation.
Sorry, it's deliberations. I don't know. I need a secretary, Dennis. Go ahead.
So what liberation was he advocating for?
So again, this is the period of colonialism. This is a period of Europeans carving out Africa. You cannot justify carving out Africa if Africans have a modern state that is existing on the continent of Africa. So that must be, at all costs, this sovereignty must be removed. So a lot of the reasons we had these boundary issues is because the indigenous people within the Liberian territory had never met a Liberian, most of them. So they were still sovereign Africans, living their sovereign African lives without interference. And so what ends up happening is that the British are trying to take Liberia. The French are trying to take Liberia because they're serving as a beacon of hope and a beacon of resistance for those they've conquered. Especially you start to see the rebellions in Sierra Leone. You got Samori Toure, who has galvanized all of these Mende ethnic groups into one Mandingo empire. You know, all of this is going on, and they're blaming Liberia for it. So this is what the negotiations were about.
Okay. So 1885 to 1889, Grover Cleveland, although a former protectorate over Liberia is contrary to our traditional policy, the moral right and duty of the United States to assist in all proper ways in the maintenance of its integrity is obvious and has been consistently announced during nearly half a century. December 1885. Benjamin Harrison, 1889 to 1893, Republican. In 1891, President Benjamin Harrison appointed McCoy U.S. Minister to Liberia, 1892 to 1893. It was a turbulent time in Liberia, which was confronting domestic insurrections caused by various rebellious tribes. McCoy successfully advocated for U.S. warships to intervene.
Yes.
And this is the part that we don't like, that a U.S. warship came to intervene and kill indigenous Liberians.
Yes. And we have to understand that there's two groups fighting. And the groups that are fighting the French are also indigenous Liberians. So this very simplified idea that it's just a homogenous group of indigenous people, the Americans come and kill them, what you have are insurgents who are fighting with the British flag over their heads versus indigenous Grebels who are fighting with the Liberian flag waving over their heads. And the ones on the British side are heavily armed with modern military weapons of the time period. And the Liberian side, Liberia has no army. You only have militias of indigenous people, and they're fighting with older guns, much of which were not even given by the Liberians at all. They're also fighting British encroachment. So you have some Grebo and Crow clans fighting British invasion with the weapons that they've had for decades. Some of them very old, rustic weapons. And they're fighting against other Grebels because these are proxy wars. Remember, the British are not there with their British redcoats. These are not white men fighting for the British. These are Grebels fighting for the British. So one of the things that I've really understood by studying primary source documents is, my God, both of the casualties on both sides were indigenous people. So if you're a Grebel person from Ivory Coast, the Americans come in, because most of those that were fighting for the British now they're under French control, but at the time they're fighting for the British. They're the ones that are being thwarted and pushed back from Liberian territory. So this idea that they just came in and killed all the native people, all the Grebels were all united against Liberia is a complete fallacy of history. It's not true. Maryland would not even be part of Liberia if Grebel people didn't defend their land against European encroachment. And that's some of the way that they erase indigenous contribution to Liberia's sovereignty by oversimplifying history. Liberia would not exist if indigenous people themselves did not fight European encroachment.
Okay. Next slide is William McKinley, 1897 to 1901. Liberia's open door policy was modeled after an earlier open door policy introduced by U.S. President William McKinley in his Secretary of State, John Haley.
Yes. So this is the last president of the 19th century. I don't know if you can see this, but before we get into it, basically the purpose of going over those old presidents is, one, because most people don't have any idea about these old American presidents. Most people have no idea, that besides George Washington, maybe people have heard of Abraham Lincoln, but most people don't know about the people in between and their mindset and how much they did not believe in the humanity of African people. So we now in the 20th century. I'm going to fast forward because much of the 20th century history, I believe anyway, is known by Liberians. So we're going to fast forward. We're going to fast forward to 1932 when W.E.B. Du Bois, or Du Bois as some like to pronounce his name, when W.E.B. Du Bois wrote and exposed President Herbert Hoover for his plans against Liberia. I'm going to explain just something really quickly before we get callers to call in. Prior to this, the Liberian legislature was really difficult to infiltrate and corrupt, believe it or not. It's hard to tell that today. So even if they got to the president and were able to manipulate the president, the Liberian legislature would just impeach him. And the same thing with the Firestone deal, the same thing with the British loan deal. The last episode of the History Channel, we talked about how the legislature refused and rejected the British loan deal and they said, hey, they're trying to put us in debt and enslave us. We don't need their money. We don't need their friendship. The Liberian legislature rebuked the British land deal. So U.S. presidents, British powers that be, were all really frustrated because they couldn't control Liberia as much as they wanted to because you had this independent legislative body that was functioning correctly at the time. The reason this becomes an issue to the United States is because the world has these colonies. The U.S. is just coming out of a Great Depression, or getting into a Great Depression, I should say, in the 1930s. Like America, the stock market crashes. America is poor. And the rest of the European world, and at this time I consider America part of the European legacy, right? America sees Europe extracting and amassing huge wealth from its colonies. And they're seeing the economic benefit that their European partners, especially Britain and France, are obtaining and how powerful they're getting. So they're looking at Liberia, they're coming up with these ideas of economically exploiting Liberia, but they can't do it as easily as they like because there's a problem. You have the people that used to be lawmakers in Liberia at this time were the most educated, the landowners. They were the people who understood the legacy of Liberia's sovereignty, and they could not just easily manipulate them. So then President Herbert Hoover famously says that he thinks the best way that they can take advantage of Liberia is to remove the whole democratic process and install a dictator.
Wow.
Install a dictator. So I want you to read his words.
Okay. Haiti and Liberia. Mr. Hoover, nominated as Justice of Negro governments in Haiti and Liberia, has blown both hot and cold and ended most unfortunately in both cases. He refused to appoint a Negro member to the Haitian Commission, and while his commission made excellent recommendations, Mr. Hoover followed them slowly and with long periods of hesitation, and he still insists at the detection of great financial interests that the United States keep indefinite control of Haitian finance. In the same way, in Liberia, he is refusing his assent to the excellent plan of reform drawn up by the League of Nations and assented by the Liberia, and he is demanding a dictator who will destroy the independence of Liberia. The United States refuses to be represented at Geneva, but the Firestone Rubber Company has headquarters there in the same hotel with Mr. Hoover's unofficial advisor. It dictates Mr. Hoover's policy. It demands the right to name the proposed dictator and refuses to recognize a Negro government which has lived more than a century.
So they're basically saying here, they're basically saying what we've all been kind of saying, which is that, I mean, not what they've all been saying, what all the previous presidents are saying. They don't really want to recognize, most of the previous presidents, a Negro government. This is the sentiment. Because what is happening in the United States at this time? You've got sharecropping going on in all the southern states, which is basically forced labor, which is basically slavery with a different name. You have lynchings going on all over the United States. You have Jim Crow. Black people are not allowed to drink out of the same water fountains. They're not allowed to enter restaurants, churches, schools. They could not even worship side by side with white people at this period of time. And here he is saying he doesn't want to recognize the sovereignty of a Negro government because the world that he lives in, Black people have no rights that white men are bound to respect. You okay?
Yep.
So this is the atmosphere of the United States. This is a time when racism was at its, I mean, this is the epicenter and of white supremacy, really. And so they don't want to even recognize. In fact, why do we have to be rejected by this legislature, these uppity people who think they know things? You have to remember Vivo Waletwe and all these people are lawmakers at this time. He's a representative from Montserrat. You've got all of these people from diverse background, but they're mostly successful farmers in Liberia, sitting in these legislative seats, making decisions for the future of their country and their children, thinking and acting in the best interest of their country. And here come the imperialists saying, this is a bad thing. This self-determination should be completely removed so that we can exert our interest as we're doing in Haiti. And if you look at Liberia and Haiti today, they are still paying the price for Black men and women, men really. History, unfortunately, at this time was about men. The women are kind of shoved underneath, the unseen, unheard, but they were definitely thinking and also advising. But this is about Haiti and Liberia sabotaged economically, overturned and overrun economically. And now you have literally a foreign government who is taking control of Liberia. The foreign president saying they're going to take over Liberia, install a dictator. Why? Because a dictator is not going to listen to lawmakers. Right. A dictator is not going to allow the judiciary or anyone to control anything. A dictator is going to do what we tell him to do. We're going to choose that person and we're going to instruct that person on how to move forward. That's what that that statement is saying.
And Du Bois is writing this.
Du Bois wrote this against Hoover. And if you go back and read the Hoover papers, that's exactly what he said. This was not a secret. This was not a secret. This is what he believed needed to happen. And his successor as well believed the same thing.
Wow. Is this the Hoover letter?
Yeah, I don't want you to read that whole thing, but that's yeah. Hoover. That's the column against that. Those are the accusations against Hoover by Du Bois. I just wanted to show you that excerpt from the Crisis newspaper. That's where that was published, and Du Bois masterfully lists out. If you want to go and check it out, he masterfully lists out all of these things that J. Edgar Hoover said. Not J. Edgar Hoover, I'm sorry, Herbert Hoover, no relation to J. Edgar Hoover, but just as evil, just as anti-African. President Herbert Hoover, things that he did against African people around the world. His crimes against African people is basically what Du Bois is listing here in this article. So we can go to the next slide and then I'll wrap up. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, infamously, he was president from 1933, took over after Hoover from 1933 to 1945. And he basically implemented Hoover's policies. Hoover planned Roosevelt executed. So he was a continuation. So I'm not going to say, that they did what they said they were going to do, but it looks like they did what they said they were going to do. And when asked, why are you interfering to this extent? Why are you doing this to this extent? And his response was, it's supposed to be sorry, IT. I apologize. Anyway, it's supposed to be it's as in it is. It is a question of race. It is a question of race. It is a question of race. Liberia exists as a response to global white supremacy and the oppression of African people everywhere. Liberia and Haiti exist as a response to the hatred of African people. We should never forget why we were created. And so it is after this point, after Franklin D. Roosevelt's era, that you start to see massive propaganda machines poured into Liberia. You start to see the development of Liberia becoming the epicenter of U.S. spy missions. You've got the Omega Tower, VOA, U.S. propaganda epicenter for not only West Africa, but their signals stretched all the way to Western Europe. So it is after this time period that Firestone becomes the largest plantation in the world. There was so much that happened. And so next episode of the Liberian History Channel, we are going to talk about Fernando Po and Firestone. We're going to get into great detail about the Fernando Po labor crisis and Firestone. But that's the end of my presentation on the American presidents and their slaveholding history and why they made it necessary for African people that they had enslaved and brutalized and abused, why they made it necessary for them to return to their country, their home of origin.
And I like this end with Franklin D. Roosevelt. He visited Liberia. This is still till this day one of the biggest news story, right? We celebrate this.
It's the coming of the conqueror, the great conqueror. So it's because we don't see the world through our own eyes. We see the world through the eyes of people who hate us. We cling to divisive, hateful stories that were exaggerated by people who hate us. And so their heroes become our heroes become our enemies. And then most of our heroes, we don't even know their names because that's the way we've been, this is how we're educated. I was telling someone the other day, they said, oh, Paul, got all these names. I said, most of the chiefs whose names we know were the slave traders. The heroes, the abolitionists, the people who did great things, the people who called for war against the French in the North Central, we don't know their names. All they say was the Northern chiefs did this. But let it be a horrible human being, we will know their name. They ask them all about themselves, right? But the ones who fought for us, we don't know their names. And those things they're really troublesome because those details are lost in history. The oral history is severed, and everyone who knew their names has been dead for generations. And this is one of the greatest tragedies. We know events that happened, and we know that they said, oh, the chief did this, but we don't know the person's name. This is horrible. It's horrible. And so one person that I have to credit for documenting the names of many of our heroes in the hinterland is Benjamin J.K. Anderson. Had he not done so, we wouldn't know many of these people. We wouldn't know Mama Musau. We wouldn't know, many, many other people, that King Doba, for example. We wouldn't know these people's names. So we thank him.
So
we
Hoover
thank Benjamin Anderson.
had this plan of installing a dictator. After Hoover is Roosevelt, and Roosevelt's presidency ended 1945.
Yes.
And right there in 1944, I see somebody there, President Tubman, who will come and rule for 27 years.
So I am going to just leave it at that. You know, the Crisis newspaper was published in 1932. Hoover made these statements in 1931, again in 1932. They were echoed again by Roosevelt when he became president, and they made it happen, I believe.
I think so too.
And if you look at all of the things that happened after Roosevelt's presidency, RIA, the airport, you know, all of the things that happened as a result, which are good and bad, right? We say it's development, but it came with a great cost. A great cost. It came at a great cost.
So, and there we are.
And remember at this time, you know, we can go ahead to the comments or open the phone lines and then, you know.
I'm setting up the phone lines now.
Okay.
Well, today is President's Day, and we've been discussing presidenthood decision or what they did, even their thought, how it related to Liberia. So we started with slavery because of this whole idea of slavery. There was a need to
right.
send people or repatriate people back to Africa, which is now Liberia. And when we became a state, a country, we were not recognized because of the same policies. And up then, when the American presidents became to be resisted by their policies were resisted by our legislature, they say, well, in our last episode, we talk about how these people mysteriously died after that. And so now coming with the Hoover's thinking of installing someone who is going to bypass all these red tapes or the legal way of doing things. And even today, there was a time, I think there was a gasoline shortage, and then the Americans will go to the Nigerian president and say, give us, because they know when you talk to one person, that person can get you whatever you want. The other way around, if you come to America, they say, oh, Congress got to do this. Congress got to vote to raise the debt ceiling. Congress has not done this. But when they come to us, they just need one person.
Yeah.
If you are watching us, and this is focused on Liberia, and this is the Liberia History Channel, call 605-313-6004, the code 791-403 # to be a part of the conversation. We have some comments here. Aloysius is watching us from Monrovia and say, thank you guys for the information and the update. Dr. Edison Pachivo, this is the part of history I don't like. The isolationism policy of the U.S., especially during the reign of Andrew Johnson, and the Monroe's doctrine that made America not to fully have Liberia as a colony in the true sense of the word made us to lose a lot of land space.
Yeah.
Darius Lamb Jabari says, shouldn't it say the ACA was founded in 1816? I think what Jabari is making reference to is from the beginning. I think.
What does it say?
Yeah, at one point when the U.S., when we talk about the establishment of the ACS, all right, I can find that now. But yeah, I think that's what he's referencing.
I think we had it covered but go ahead.
Mansfield Duopo, with all that history, how come our founding fathers assumed all the vestiges of the U.S. that was adamantly against their self-determination? Mansfield, please explain what you say, assume the vestiges of the U.S. He continued, the oppressed, when given a chance, becomes an oppressor. Dr. Pajibo, it made sense to me that America at the time refused to see Liberia as a colony, but a country with which she has special relationship when pressed by European powers. This made us lose a lot of territories and forced us into hasty independence. Mansfield said the same way the political elites refused to recognize the natives. Human beings were enslaved, don't sugarcoat it. Tobasi, can a treaty be repealed, broken, cancelled, or terminated? What is the termination clause of the treaty between America and Liberia? Can the U.S. president terminate the treaty between America and Liberia? Folks, can a treaty be for life? Many American presidents never addressed the concern of Black American immigration. The U.S. government never cared about their condition. Masakoli, which political party, Democrat or Republican in the United States, that promoted or gave more support to Liberia? Carl, those are some of the comments.
Okay, so that was a lot. I didn't write anything down.
But let's start with this one, Republican or Democrat. From the beginning, we didn't even have those.
Listen, if you really look at U.S. policy towards Liberia, this is why I always laugh when people say, Republicans, there was once a Republican Democratic Party. The Republicans and the Democrats really, are two sides of the same coin when it comes to their interaction with African people,
right?
Historically speaking. So the answer to that question is there's really no difference. I mean, you could say Ulysses Grant was head of the Union Army, but he was a slaveholder. And he did, employed Black people in the military, but he was a staunch racist. People look at reasons to try to love people who hate them. And I'm not going to, that's all I got to say about that. I mean, the bottom line is at that period in history, this is 17th to late 17th to the late 18th century. The late 17th to the 18th century. Oh my God, I'm so tired, Dennis. The late 18th to the 19th century presidents were extremely racist and hateful toward African people. So political parties at that time in history all agreed, even if individual didn't believe in slavery. People on both, parties, and all political parties were slaveholders. The Whigs, there was also a party called the Whig Party, as you saw, the Federalist Party. Everyone had members that owned human beings and also felt the need to remove them to Africa. So there were some individuals that said, hey, no, don't deport them, but most people said, get them out of here. So the political party thing is was there anything else that was important for us to cover? I mean, Mr. Dwapul, with the repetitive comments, the continuous regurgitation of the hate speech, the anti-Liberian hate speech, without any substantiated facts, contradicting primary source documents on the matter. I don't really want to get into that debate. This was presenting this information, but no, Liberians, the African Americans, when they returned to Liberia, when they did not enslave people. That is not true. It's not substantiated anywhere. And they also did not exclude people. If you go back and you watch the Liberian History Channel, you will see evidence to the contrary. Now, what happens on, with the indoctrination and the old, anti-African education process that occurs, especially after 1944, you really start to see it. And so the anti-African education process is something that all of us go through, including indigenous people. We start to rebuke our own selves as well. And that is horrible. And it is a horrible thing. But to say that, to take that and then push it back 100 years and accuse people who hadn't even been through that yet of doing it, I think is false. We have to look at history in a time period, and it's a continuum. And we have to also look and see what happened to change the initial trajectory towards unity and why it broke down and why you then have these very rigid distinctions between Africans and what people started to consider civilized. But you cannot project that backwards into infinity because there's just no evidence of it. It's something that happened much later and much more intensely and deliberately. It's like the whole idea that, only all the native people were fighting the government and only the Liberians were, defending the government. It's a lie. If that had been the case, there would be no Liberia. Liberia would have been destroyed way before independence. So we have to understand that the lies that we were told, that indigenous people did not participate in building the country, that indigenous people did not participate in guaranteeing and defending the sovereignty of the country, these are lies. Our ancestors are the reason we have Liberia. And so that was an answer to about 6 different comments you read from Mr. Duapo.
Yeah. Actual fact, Democrats were probably the most racist of all American parties.
That's not true. I already answered that one.
Republicans were more helpful to Africans than Democrats.
I disagree with that. And that's a myth. So the thing that's funny is that it becomes this big myth. Look and see what political party Herbert Hoover belonged to. And that's what is important, right? So this, this whole obsession with Democrats and Republicans is also a false consciousness. It's a false consciousness. The disagreement between these people in the 19th century, the parties and their thought processes do not look like what they, in the 21st century, what they look like in the 19th century. If you look at history that way, you'll confuse yourself. But if at all there was a dictator installed, it was done so by the Republicans. And I think, that is an affront to our sovereignty.
Jimmy Eastman said, forced labor in Liberia built the Firestone fortune and transformed Princeton. Call, can you comment? Come next week? No,
yeah, week? Let's talk about that next week, Jimmy. This is not about that. I mean, I wanted to end where I ended for a reason. Next week, we'll talk about the Firestone, and Fernando Po crisis.
Yeah. Dr. Paget was asking for Brown versus the Board of Education. That landmark race case influenced American policy in Africa, Liberia, did it?
So all of these cases, all of the progression, the progress towards human rights, equality, justice in America was spearheaded by African people in America. African Americans are the ones who looked at things like the first ever public education scheme was pushed by Black Americans. The very first ever idea of integrating schools and equal education and equal rights was pushed by Black Americans. So the fight towards justice, equality, even in immigration, the fact that Dennis and I are sitting here today as free will immigrants to the United States, those rights were fought for and won again by Black Americans. It is also African Americans who, through their social justice advocacy, even those who did not return to Liberia, consistently defended Liberian sovereignty. We had a show on that where Jabari Lamb and I, Jabari led that episode. So yes, the two are interchangeable. The two are interchangeable. We had very segregated schools. The early Liberians that would come here to go to school, for the most part, were going to schools that were Black schools. You had a couple of Africans that were permitted to go to Harvard. They were not allowed to sit in the classroom with white students. They had to sit in the hallway and listen. If you look at photos of Wolo at Harvard, he's sitting in the hallway. He's not allowed to enter the classroom. That never happened in Liberia. People who like to compare the two, where you go to UL, you got to sit in the hallway and only the big boys can sit in the class. So we have to understand how incredibly hateful American policy was towards African people at this period in history. It's not the America we live in today. And those changes were fought for and won by African people in this country.
Thank you. I want to announce tomorrow at 7 p.m. we have Abby Tyler Healthy Living, 7 p.m. This February is the Heart Health Month. So join Abby and the cardiologist as a special guest, Dr. Anish Koka. They're going to be talking about heart health. You don't want to miss it. Then at 1 in the day is the Hour of Politics with Anthony C.A. And come 8 o'clock, we're going to do a post-interview analysis. Last night we had individuals who resigned from the Spoon TV. They were interviewed tomorrow night. We're going to do a post-interview analysis. You don't want to miss that. Always tune into Focus on Liberia. We give you the very best.
Yes.
Call. We have one caller here. Let me open for one caller. Caller, your name and where you calling from.
You know who this is. This is Jabari.
Oh, Jabari, go ahead. You're live.
Yeah, so I want to say it's a great presentation, Carl. I just want to put the information that these American presidents never really had Liberia's interest at heart. They never really cared about it. It was on the back burner, and whether or not it was refusing to do recognition, providing necessary funding for immigrants to immigrate, not passing any bill legislation. These American presidents never really cared. As long as they couldn't extract resources, the gold, or Firestone using the rubber plantation, they really didn't care about Liberia. They could have cared less about its existence.
Thank you.
That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Jabari. Thank you. All right, Carl. I think that's all the callers we have. Let's wrap it up.
All right. So basically, when I don't know if this is relevant, but when we talk about the past, we were not there. We were not alive. It has to be based on evidence, not sentiment, not what we think, not what we experience today, and we're going to project it back on yesterday. It has to be on what is documented. Unfortunately, that's all we have to go off. And so what I've noticed is that when you do that, you get to not only free yourself, but you get to free your ancestors from being swept under the rug, the proverbial rug of history. It is not in the best interest of the sons and daughters of the soil of Liberia to project themselves as animalistic savages that had no power, that had no impact on the creation, the protection, the defense of their country. This is one of the greatest tragedies that has come out of this false narrative about our people. So everyone believes that we did not contribute and we did not advocate and we did not defend and press forward the agenda for our own sovereignty. This is the tragedy. So when we present these things, we have to sometimes suspend our disbelief and look at the evidence with an open mind. Once that's done, then you can draw a conclusion. But if we continue to just repeat what we think without having hard and fast evidence of those thoughts, to back up those thoughts, we may inadvertently be carrying the torch for the disinformation that destroyed our country and our legacy and our heritage. I grew up believing all of the things everybody else grew up believing because that's all that was fed to us. It is not until I started to learn and think and study for myself and started understanding how history is manipulated and weaponized against countries, especially against African people. History becomes the tool of dehumanization. And this presentation about the presidents, the concept that we have that America created Liberia and was happy to give Liberia, African people a sovereign country, the historical record does not show that. We even had a president who was a slave trader, so it's not all, peachy cream and rosy. The reality of our history is empowering and it's enlightening. That's what I wanted to share. But thanks for watching.
Thank you. And Bob, this one is for Bobby is asking for if we have Liberian president that were indigenous before 1980. I say, come next week, Bobby. We're going to talk about one of those presidents.
2 weeks. Next week, we're talking about Fernando Poe and
this week Saturday we're going to talk about one of those presidents. So you don't want to miss it. So come. I don't want to keep you.
I'm sorry. Yes, Dennis, you're right. I've got it mixed up. This Saturday we're talking about our first, and as far as I know, our first, no, it is our first. I've done the genealogy, so it's true. It is our first Indigenous president. And then after that, we're going to do Fernando Po. So I apologize. This Saturday is Howard, and the following Saturday is Fernando Po and Firestone Labor Crisis.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Carl, and thank our viewers. Thank to even those who are going to watch later. Always keep it here. Focus on Liberia. We do it all. It can be literature, business, finance, and economics, history, politics, religion, and what have you. All right here on Focus on Liberia. Keep watching us from Sunday to Sunday. We now want to close the broadcast with our song that says, "We are all Liberians." It's very important. People keep asking for this song. Let us live this song. We are all Liberians. I mean, seriously, we are, right? Whether you believe that your first president or all our presidents were, or whatever you believe about Liberia and how you want the politics, what policies, what political party, what social class you belong to, we are all Liberians. Okay? Let's think about that and make sure that we all fight with everything in us to make our country the glorious land of liberty. Have a good night. We are all Liberians, y'all.
We are Liberians. Liberia is our home.